University of California, Los Angeles, 1969. A young computer programming student wanders through the halls of the UCLA campus. He was told by one of his professors to meet at something called the Imp Room at 9 a.m. He looks down at a piece of paper that had the room number and location of the Imp Room. "That can't be right," he said to himself. The piece of paper read 3420 Bolter Hall. The trouble is, that room was in the basement of a very strange and isolated building on campus. He hesitantly makes his way to the basement of the very isolated building, and as he walks down the silent hallway, he begins to hear a humming sound. Must be the air conditioning, he thought. He walks to the room and opens the door. The first thing he sees in the room are the very dim fluorescent lights that are barely illuminating the pale yellow walls. The room was very dull with just about a dozen chairs and desks, but one thing did stand out. There was a 6-foot-tall white mechanical box in the corner of the room that looked like it was attached to a typewriter. He also noticed that the machine was producing that loud humming sound that he heard in the hallway. He walks over to examine it. "I see you found our imp," a professor says as he enters the doorway. "This is the imp?" the student says, utterly confused. "Interface Message Processor. It's a secret project that us at UCLA, as well as Stanford and MIT, have been working on for the last few years. It's a new state-of-the-art technology, and we need some computer programming students that are willing to help us out to make this project work. Are you interested?" "I guess so," the student said. "Okay, great. Well, let me be the first to formally welcome you to the ARPANET team." Now, ARPANET, which stands for Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, was a project that began being funded by the United States military in the 1960s. The military thought that it could be extremely beneficial for them if they could have a communication network to share computer resources instead of having to physically transfer all of the computer resources themselves. The idea was simple. Any information you wanted to send through a computer would get transmitted in a unit called a packet. The receiving computer would then read the packets and try to reconstruct the original information. However, this was much easier said than done. The young computer programmer, whose name was Charlie Klein, worked on the project for almost an entire year before he was ready to finally do the first test of the ARPANET. On October 29, 1969, at 10:30 p.m., members from the Stanford campus were on the phone with Charlie as he was preparing to send the first message over the ARPANET. He thought he would only send one word to try and keep it as simple as possible and to try and not overload the system on the first go. The word he chose to send was log in. He enters the word into the imp. Seconds later, the Stanford students on the other line tell him, "Hey, we got your message, but what does low mean?" Charlie soon realizes that the ARPANET crashed only after sending the first 2 letters of the word login. So over the next 2 hours, he kept programming and trying to fix the bug. Then he sent the same message again. It was a success. That's right, the first 2 messages sent over the primitive form of what would become the internet were low and log in. Over the next few years, the technology of the ARPANET would improve to the point where students from across the country could communicate instantly with each other using their school's imps. In 1972, one young computer programmer at Stanford, who was also a marijuana drug dealer on the side, thought it could be kind of a cool and funny idea to see if he could potentially expand his customer base using the ARPANET technology. So he sent a message from Stanford to a friend that he had at MIT, which is in Massachusetts. The message went something along the lines of, "A baggie of Mary Jane for $20? The MIT students replied with one word: deal. That was the birth of what we know today as e-commerce. It is true that back then there was no online banking or online transactions, so we don't really know for sure if this deal actually went through offline. It probably didn't. But what we do know is that this was the first agreement in which one buyer agreed to purchase a product over the internet. But in order to see how influential this technology would become, we do have to go back just a few years and make our way to Paris. This audiobook series is brought to you by Joisk.com. 2-hour free delivery on hundreds of items, no memberships required, no fees, just speed. Joisk. Now back to the audiobook. June 1967. In England, a well-known rock band called The Beatles had just released their album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which would go on to be one of the best-selling and most critically acclaimed albums in history. Over in Egypt, the country woke up on the morning of June 5th, 1967 to a surprise attack from Israel. This resulted in a counterattack against Israel where Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan started what is known as the Six-Day War. On June 12, 1967, the United States had the Supreme Court case of Loving v. Virginia, where the court ruled that U.S. state laws that prohibited interracial marriages were unconstitutional. And on June 17th, the People's Republic of China tested its first hydrogen bomb. Despite all of these important historical events, arguably the most important thing that happened in June of 1967 occurred in Paris, France. A 34-year-old Iranian man named Cyrus had moved from Iran to France in the early 1960s in order to pursue a better education. Over the next 7 years, he would complete a degree at the University of Paris, meet the love of his life while at university, and finish medical school in 1967 with a specialization in urology. Shortly after graduating, Cyrus and his girlfriend, now wife, had given birth to a son. They decided to name their son Parvi, which means fortunate in Persian. Cyrus and his family were sure very fortunate because he had just got the opportunity to become a doctor at a medical center in the United States. And this wasn't just any medical center. This was Johns Hopkins University, the worldwide leader in medical research and innovation. So, Cyrus, his wife, and son decided to pack up and move to the United States. By this time, Parvi was in kindergarten, and for the first time, he had to make friends with people that were not French. It was a little difficult for some of the other kids to pronounce his name, so his family and friends decided to call him by another name which is easier to pronounce in English: Pierre. Now, as Cyrus continued to work as a urologist at Johns Hopkins University, Pierre began growing up. In 9th grade, while at Potomac University, he noticed something that he had only seen on TV.
Gentlemen, move over for my friend Vic. The Commodore VIC-20. Move over? The Commodore VIC-20 does more than your machines. It's a great computer that also plays great games. Like this, and this, and this.
Commodore VIC-20. This was one of the most revolutionary computers of its time, and in 1980 became the first computer in history to surpass 1 million units sold. Pierre was interested, so he began playing around with it in his spare time. Then he learned how to program and eventually became so entranced by this new computing technology that he would skip gym class just so he could play around with his school computers. Instead of being punished for skipping class, the principal of his high school actually hired him to write a computer program to print catalog cards for the school library at a rate of about $6 an hour. Not bad. After graduating from high school in 1984, Pierre moved to Massachusetts in order to pursue a computer science degree at Tufts University. While working on a bachelor's degree in computer science at Tufts, he wrote a program to help Apple Macintosh programmers manage memory. He released the software for free, but asked the users pay on the honor system. Only a few checks dribbled through the mail after he released the software. It was barely enough to cover the cost of the post office box he'd rented to collect the checks. After graduating with a computer science degree in 1988, Pierre went to work for Claris, which was a subsidiary of Apple Computers. Claris was responsible for creating some of Apple's key software products like Mac Paint and Mac Draw. Pierre stayed at the company for about 3 years, but then he decided to take his life in a different direction. It was time for him to take a risk and start his own company. In 1991, Pierre and 3 of his friends founded a company to write programs for the pen computing market. In order to sell some of these programs online, he had to set up an early e-commerce part of the site called eShop. However, as it turned out, pen computing was one of the more notable technology flops of the 90s, but the eShop part of the site was lucrative enough to attract the attention of Microsoft, who later bought the company. After years of being fed up with the stress that comes with owning a startup, Pierre took a job as the developer relations engineer for the software maker General Magic in 1994. General Magic at the time was a very secretive yet exciting new startup company in Silicon Valley. You see, the company was working on some technologies that were so far ahead of everyone else that they were actually too early for its time. For example, take the software technology called Telescript. Telescript was made with the intent of creating a standard for transmitting messages among many machines that compute regardless of who makes them, similar to how Messenger, WhatsApp, and iMessage work today. They also made an operating system in 1994 called Magic Cap. The operating system itself was nothing special, as Windows and Mac already had market-dominating, top-tier operating systems for personal computers. However, what made General Magic's OS special was that it actually wasn't used for personal computers. It was used for another device. A device that at the time barely existed, but within 2 decades would become one of the most popular consumer items on the planet. General Magic's operating system was for something called a mobile phone. It is true that Pierre Omidyar was working on some game-changing technologies at General Magic. However, he still wanted to make a little money on the side by making a website of some kind. So, in 1995, he began fiddling around with some computer code and created a personal webpage for himself. The webpage featured a few things that Pierre was interested, along the lines of news stories and an entire section on the Ebola virus. However, there was one part of the site that stood out from the others. You see, Pierre had built one portion of his site as a kind of internet experiment. He wanted to know if he could build an auctioning service to sell some items around his house that he just wanted to get rid of. So after some long programming nights, it was finally built. And the first item that he put up on the new auctioning service that he called Auction Web was a broken laser pointer. He knew that no one would buy this item, but he thought it was a good way to test functionality of his website. So after a long day's work, he put his computer away and forgot about the laser pointer. The next day, Pierre opened his computer and was shocked. His eyes opened wide in surprise for what he was looking at. $14.83. That is what the winning bid was on his broken laser pointer. Suddenly, Pierre had a different view of his personal webpage. Maybe this could be something big, he thought to himself. So he began posting more items, and they kept selling. Soon, many other sellers began signing up for the website, and more people started buying. It was at this moment that he knew he had something here. Something that could change the way the world shops for goods. Knowing this, he decided to rebrand Auction Web and change the name of the company to a domain that he had recently purchased. He renamed his website eBay. But little did Pierre know that there was someone else in the United States with a similar idea. A young Wall Street executive who recently moved to Seattle in order to launch a small, plucky startup that wants to sell books online. That someone is named Jeff Bezos. Thank you very much for listening to part 1 of this series, eBay versus Amazon. If you enjoyed this episode, we would like to ask you to leave a like, comment, or review from whatever platform you're watching or listening to this on. It helps us out a lot. We would also like to ask you to check out our sponsor and the company that I founded myself, Joisk.com. Whether you are an entrepreneur looking to sell items online, or you are someone who just wants to buy an item and have it delivered in under 2 hours, then Joisk.com is the right website for you. I'm Jack Chapple, and thank you for listening.